Hi, good morning all. Welcome to the From Vulnerability to Risk Public Sector Attack Surface Management webinar. My name is James Rook and I have the privilege of leading MTI's sales organisation in the UK. And I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan Lee, the Director of Public Sector Relations at Trend Micro, and Nick Ross, Technical Partner Manager at Trend Micro. For 30 years, MTI has been at the forefront of helping UK organisations, public sector organisations in the UK, navigate the complex landscape of cyber threats. MTI are a founding member of CREST, and we are one of the longest standing providers of pen testing or penetration testing services. And we continue to evolve our portfolio and offerings to meet the emerging threats from managed security operation centres and services, customer cyber defences. We understand the growing complexity and resource constraints faced by the public sector. Today, we will step you through how we can help you meet and achieve best practice standards in evolving compliance and regulations such as CAF. How we can help continuously discover asset vulnerabilities and prioritising them based on the risk that they pose to your organisation. Effectively communicating risks and threat levels within your organisation from C-level through to cyber analysis. So shortly I'll hand over to Jonathan to set the scene on the current threat landscape, the ever-growing regulation complexities and risks to our organisations. Jonathan will then hand over to Nick, who will talk through how we're helping our customers and organisations develop their next-gen cybersecurity strategies. The emergence of ASRM solutions, including a platform demonstration of Trend's attack surface risk management tool. And then I'll summarise just by wrapping up some of the key points and talking about how we can maximise the value of your investments. I'd like to point out we do have a live Q&A feature, so if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please do feel free to ask any questions. We will capture them and ensure that we respond if it's a general question to everybody, but if it's a specific question to your organisation, we'll make sure that we respond directly to you. But for now, one more welcome from me, and please let me hand over to Jonathan Lee, Director of Public Sector Relations at Trend Micro.
Thank you very much, James, and good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people on the session today. So as James mentioned, I'm going to be setting the scene effectively so that Nick can talk about what we can do to help you manage risk within your organisation. We're in a world of regulatory and compliance-driven cybersecurity at the moment. We've got a very complex threat landscape and we've got an evolving threat landscape too. So I'm going to cover all of that hopefully in the next 15 minutes, and then Nick can show you what you can do about mitigating the risk around that. So if you think about kind of where we are now from a digitalization journey, we've come a long way in the last, I'd say 10 years, but I realise we're now in 2025. So in 2014, you'd probably be amazed, for those of you old enough to remember, that was when the tax disc, the paper tax disc that you used to get from your local post office was phased out. That seems amazing now when you think about how we actually interact with public services digitally, you know, whether it be the gov.uk website where we can do all manner of things around tax and benefits and those kind of things. During the pandemic, we had the amazing Test and Trace app in terms of trying to stop the spread of an infectious disease. Who'd have thought that would have been possible 10, 11 years ago? And then we move forward to today as well, and we look at, well, the NHS app. The NHS app itself is used by 34 million citizens across the UK. That's just amazing in terms of that interaction that we've got with digital technology and public services. And only the other day, the government announced its gov.uk app, which will look to streamline and provide a personalised service around government services and includes things like a digital driving licence. So we really are moving to a digital way of life. It's really changed massively. And at the same time, we've got this big agenda around growth from the government, obviously, and part of that is around artificial intelligence. And they talk about AI increasing productivity from an economic growth point of view in GDP. But from a public services point of view, for those of us on the call here, it's all about providing better public services at scale and a better citizen experience. And from an NHS perspective, if we look at where that's already being used, all of the stroke centres across England are all using artificial intelligence to improve the care of the around 80,000 people that have a stroke in England every single year. When you think about that, that's amazing. That's sort of better time to care and treatment and better patient outcomes. But it's not just in the sort of areas of strokes as well. We're also talking about diagnostic imaging. So things like radiology, detecting diseases earlier, predictive healthcare, thinking about risk stratification, for example, and patient flow models. And then from an administrative point of view, that back office that costs a heck of a lot to administer every single year, we can look at things like patient triaging and algorithms around appointment scheduling. So the opportunity of this is massive. However, we've got a real millstone around our neck, and that's the cybersecurity technical debt that we've got out there. It's the environment that we've got that creates risk for us as a public sector. So, we've got an AI generated image on the one hand here of what cybersecurity technical debt apparently looks like, at the same time as we've got this massive millstone around our neck. On the right hand side of the screen here, we've got a screenshot from a workshop that, for those of you that are in the NHS, you may well have seen. So this is talking about that move from analog to digital around, patient care. So it flags here, sufficient investments not been made in the basic technology and innovation, and the fact that technology has been deprioritized. So you've got this friction between the need to move towards artificial intelligence to speed things up. We've got this technical debt, all of which creates risk, and that's what we'll be talking about today. And this has been identified for those of you that will have seen the National Cybersecurity Centre's annual review that was published at the back end of last year. Really, the takeaway comment for me was this need to wake up as a country, as a nation. They talk about the UK needing to wake up to the severity of that cyber threat. And all public sector organisations and private as well need to see cybersecurity as both an essential part of resilience, and we'll come back to that word resilience in a minute, and a driver for business growth. But I'd add to that business growth there, productivity of public services and making money go further. And again, that's something that we'll come to. And we'll come to that because we've all heard about this financial black hole that the Treasury talks about all of the time. And we've got the spring statement coming up and the spending review. So you've got this real friction, as I'm sure you're aware, between all these risks on the one hand, some of which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And at the same time, we've got the attack surface growing and the disruptive nature of cyber threats growing all the time. So we need to find a way forward around this, I would argue. So I'm sure everybody on this call's heard of the Synovus supply chain attack. It was possibly, well, actually not just my words, it was one of the most impactful cyber attacks that's happened in the UK for many years, because it affected people's lives beyond sort of its a mere financial impact. And they're not my words, they're the words of Kieran Martin, the founder, CEO of the National Cybersecurity Centre. He said that yesterday at a Royal United Services Institute event when they were talking about risk stratification around cybersecurity. But this real world impact meant that there were things like, calls for O-type blood donations, loads of appointments were cancelled, data was stolen and exfiltrated. And what this really, really, really meant, though, was that when things go wrong, it has a real physical impact on patients. We're moving away from that idea of data going missing, your identity being compromised, people trying to extort and scam. We're talking about two patients have suffered long-term or permanent damage to their health as a result of a supply chain attack on the NHS, which is a scary place to be when you think about that was in London. What about if this happened at scale? And this is not about fear, uncertainty, or doubt. It's about real-world examples of what's happened. And this is not just an NHS problem. I mentioned some NHS examples there of how AI is being used, but also the impact of cyber attacks on the NHS as well. On the left-hand side here, we can see the cybersecurity breaches survey from last year talking about the education sector. So a staggering 97% of HE institutions had a cyber breach last year. We just need to think about that, 97% of people. And then on the right-hand side here, the National Audit Office, the NAO, only on last week or the week before, the 29th of January, had a report which talked about the fact that, again, government needs to sit up and listen and invest in cybersecurity technology. because they'd found 58 critical central government IT systems that had significant gaps in cyber resilience, and another 228 legacy ones that they just didn't know how resilient they were. And this is against a backdrop of a skills gap that we all recognise in our organisations, where 1 in 3 security roles across central government were either vacant or filled by temporary staff throughout the whole financial year. So it paints a really challenging picture of an advancing threat, a move to digitalisation, but also a need to go further and stratify and quantify risk. And we all know that geopolitically things are tricky at the moment. This is Pat McFadden, member of the cabinet. He was talking about Russia ready to wage cyber war on the UK. Now, sometimes you can think these things are just quite hyperbolic, but actually no. On the right-hand side of the screen here, we've got an example of local authorities that suffered denial of service attacks recently that were caught in the crossfire, as it were. They weren't sort of doing anything themselves, but because of the UK support for Ukraine, they were being targeted by a threat actor. So really what we need to do is look from moving from cybersecurity to resilience. You know, cybersecurity has become a business continuity problem and a service continuity problem for us that work in the public sector. This has been identified by the government. So since the government's come into power, they've really recognised the fact that regulation and legislation has lagged behind that of our European counterparts. So, you know, in Europe, we've got NIS2, for example, that never got transcribed in or transposed into UK law. So one of the first things that Peter Kyle, the Secretary of State for DSET, did was put into the King's Speech the new Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, which looks to sort of strengthen the regulatory framework around reporting and that kind of thing. And then you may well have seen as well that there's a proposed ban for us in the public sector in terms of paying ransom payments. So again, that's open to consultation at the moment. So I'd urge you to input into that if you've got access to do so. So we've also got standards everywhere. I often call this like an alphabet soup of acronyms, really. We've got NIST2, NIST, PSN, DSPT, etc., 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 but all aiming to do the same thing, which is to raise the bar of the standard of cybersecurity maturity to make us harder to attack. And so really where it's at for us on this call today is the Cyber Assessment Framework. So the CAF, which I'm sure everybody's aware of, which was developed to improve the security and resilience of essential services across critical infrastructure initially, but it was designed for UK organisations specifically around the government's cybersecurity strategy. So I think personally this is a really good way of baselining your cybersecurity and then making sure that you continuously improve on it, because it's very much outcomes based rather than controls based, and it focuses on these 4 overarching domains, A, B, C, D. We'll come to some of those in a minute. And it looks at best practice, for example. So a very good thing in my mind in terms of moving the level of cybersecurity maturity forward. One thing that you can do, so we've created a document at Trend Micro which takes you through how we map onto the Cyber Assessment Framework. So you can either scan the QR code here, or we can provide the document afterwards, or you can find it on our public sector websites. And that tells you how we then meet those controls as well. So that's quite a useful document to download. But what this looks like, for example, for a local authority is something like this, like a little map here, which talks about the controls that are in place. But this is not just something for local authorities. As I mentioned, it's kind of operators of essential services. So initially, this was mandated via GovAssure across central government. But now it's kind of going out into the NHS, for example, with the CAF becoming the basis of the data security and protection toolkit. So I really do think it's an effective mechanism of understanding the level of cyber resilience across your organisation that boards can buy into and feed into their kind of risk register and things like that as well. So very for this. I'd very much I'd suggest that you look at that document that we showed the QR code for a minute ago, and there's a table in here which talks about how all of our portions of our solution, because we have a platform, a Vision One platform, how these all fit together and then provide you with controls for objectives A, B, C, and D. What we're specifically talking about today, though, is managing risk. So we're talking about trend attack surface risk management, which overarches objectives A, managing security risk, and B, protecting against cyber attacks. So you might think, great, I've got this compliance framework, I can rest on my laurels now, I can tick a box and everything. I'm sure you don't really think that, but you know, we mustn't get caught in this tick box mentality. because regulation and legislation takes a while to go through Parliament, to be inputted into, and to then come out the other end. And often by the time these regulations or laws have been passed, they're out of date, because cybersecurity is a ever changing battle and something that's never won. So we need to be in front of the threat landscape. It's a laudable aim to raise the bar of cybersecurity maturity through things like the CAF, but we don't need to be complacent on reaching compliance. We talk in the public sector about defending as one and secure by design. We mustn't forget through that our supply chain. So we mentioned Synovus there, the massive impact that you can have through a supply chain attack, but also making sure that we're not always retrofitting security. We need to be designing security in at the outset when we're putting new systems in. I heard an NHS colleague the other day talking on a podcast that I was listening to about treating cybersecurity as like part of a multidisciplinary team within a health setting, for example. I thought it was a really good analogy in terms of bringing cyber in at the start as an enabler of business transformation, especially as we look at artificial intelligence. So don't rest on your laurels. I don't think good enough is good enough. We need to be proactive and take a proactive approach to cybersecurity. And that's what Nick's going to be talking about in a minute, around that kind of risk management, because risk isn't static, it changes all the time. So you need to be assessing constantly and dynamically and continually monitoring and mitigating what's going on within your environment. So I would argue from a public sector point of view, we often focus on data breaches, where's this data gone and this, that, the other. And whilst, for example, citizen data around health is obviously very troubling if it goes missing, it doesn't stop you from being treated. Something like the Synovus attack shows you that if services stop, people ultimately can be harmed physically. And that goes across everything, doesn't it? That goes across schools, universities, local authorities. When services can't be delivered, there are real world consequences. So you need to look at working backwards from the impact of disruption to assess that risk. And we have a model here that looks at how you do that, which informs the way that our attack surface risk management tool works. So we look at kind of, first of all, what does that attack path look like? So that where is that risk? And what's the likelihood of someone going after that particular entry point into your network? So looking at kind of how they might get in, why they might get in, and what they're trying to get to. So it says crown jewels here. That for me in the public sector is predominantly about service delivery and being able to keep your services running, keep patients being treated, pupils being taught, bins being collected, etc., etc. But by understanding this risk, you can start to build that resilience. So that's what Nick's going to talk about today. But you don't just need to do that on a sort of static basis. Like I mentioned, I'm going to just talk about this once more. You need to do this on a continuous basis, continuously discovering what those new risks might be and going back to it, prioritizing that risk, and then putting those mitigations in place automatically if you can. And then what that leads you to be able to do is better articulation of that risk to your board. And we know there's a general problem in terms of being able to articulate that risk to boards. So my final slide here before I pass over to Nick is talking about one of our case study customers, Together Housing, and they said one of their biggest challenges was translating that cybersecurity risk to the board level, because you've got people on the board that obviously have to cover a very broad range of areas in terms of risk to their organizations, fire, flood, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. And cyber is definitely on the same footing as that. So one of the things they really love about the platform Nick's about to show you as part of his presentation is the fact that you get a simple risk score to show you what that risk is like. And they're able to go to their board on a continuous basis and say, last time it was this, we've put these things in place based on the intelligence that we've got, and now we're in a much better position in terms of being resilient. So it's that continuous prioritization of risk and doing this on a continuous basis that I would advocate in today's world of, geopolitical threats, accidental attacks, the insider threat, be it malicious or otherwise. We're in an interesting world where we need to focus on making sure that we continuously look at this risk to be proactive from a cybersecurity standpoint. With that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Nick, who's going to talk to you about attack surface risk management.
Thank you, Jonathan. And it's a pleasure to be here this morning talking to you all. Thank you to our friends at MTI for inviting us on this call. It really is a pleasure to talk about what we feel is the next generation of the evolution of cybersecurity risk management technology, and ultimately helping you and your organizations be much more resilient when it comes to identifying and understanding what your cyber risk profile looks like. So I'm going to get stuck in here. Let me just move on my slides a little bit here. So one thing to consider here is that we are taking a much more proactive approach to managing your cyber risk. I think it's fair to say that a lot of organisations in the UK public sector and wider in the commercial space as well have invested in cyber tools over the years that have been very good at doing point products, solving very specific problems within their organizations, but they are very much waiting for things to go wrong and then responding or being reactive to those things that have gone wrong within their cybersecurity landscape. What we're talking about here is actually getting onto a front foot and being far more proactive at being resilient to cyber threats. So, be able to predict and proactively mitigate the risk before those things happen. Security posture and actually being one step ahead of the bad guys is the ultimate game here. And also, as we'll come on to in a bit more detail during the presentation, is connecting cyber risk to business risk or organizational risk, because we all hopefully know that actually cyber risk is such a high profile thing these days that it is, it should be important to everyone across the organization, not just the CISO or the IT teams. One thing that we would also talk about, and I know Jonathan alluded to this earlier on with his slide on compliance, is how do I make sure that I'm staying ahead of the game when it comes to compliance audits that might be happening within my organisation. So we'll touch on that as well. I guess one thing to consider is that ASRM as a technology is really helping customers communicate cyber risk at a better level and answer some of the really difficult questions that organizations have. So, for example, do I have complete visibility of all the risks in my environment? We find often the answer is no. Organizations only really know about the risks that they've installed controls to mitigate against particular cyber challenges they might have. Also, what steps do organizations need to be thinking about taking to improve their cyber posture and lessen the likelihood of an attack? How do I suppose perhaps very pertinent to the public sector is how do I make the best use of my team and the technology and time that we have available, because those resources are perhaps very limited. And finally, I guess it can be quite overwhelming sometimes for cybersecurity operations teams. The amount of events and alerts that they see on a day-to-day basis is so intense that actually, as far as a lot of the technology that a lot of customers use, is everything is urgent. And actually, how do I prioritize one urgent thing from a list of thousands of other urgent things? So being able to actually take really focused action and do the things that will improve the cyber security posture of an organization most effectively are what we're talking about here. One thing to bear in mind, as I mentioned earlier on, is that cyber risk is organizational risk. And so actually having tools like attack surface risk management that we're talking about on the call today really help communicate risk both upstream and downstream within the organization to different people, I guess people who are ultimately interested in articulating risk to the business. But also what we're talking about here is providing the right intelligence needed to perhaps make really sophisticated investments. So making sure that organizations are investing limited funds in the right technologies in the right spaces, as opposed to sort of blanket technologies, which can sometimes be very expensive to mitigate against risks that perhaps aren't actually a priority to the organization. By furnishing them with the right information, they can make those really joined up decisions and really make sure that their limited funds are being spent on the things that are going to be most effective to mitigate risk within that organization. It's a bit of an old adage, but you can't protect what you don't know about. And this is quite an interesting stat from ESG, from some threat management research that was done recently, where it was found that over 70% of organizations actually experienced some sort of cyber attack, in which the attack itself started with the exploit of an unknown, unmanaged, or poorly managed or configured internet-facing asset. I suppose the reality is, going back to the point I made earlier, organizations have spent a lot of good money on cybersecurity tooling that effectively is doing a good job, but that's only protecting the assets that the organization knows about and therefore is prioritizing. What ASRM brings to the party is really helping organizations identify the weak spots in their security posture and making sure that they're appropriately protecting the devices that they perhaps don't currently know about. And we know the attack surface is very sophisticated these days. The bad guys are typically going after, Jonathan mentioned legacy debt earlier on, having legacy resources and legacy assets, perhaps running out of date operating systems or legacy applications in your environment, is ultimately a risk factor that we need to take into account. But yeah, the cyber criminals are very wise to these things. They don't go after the well-protected assets in your environment. They will typically go after the things that you either don't know you have or aren't appropriately configured, as the previous slide mentioned. And so actually, again, this helps, I suppose, tooling that helps customers all understand what their entire attack surface looks like also allows them to apportion time and money to protect those assets in an appropriate manner. Attack surface management isn't new by all means. There have been a number of different technologies on the market for some time that are very much focused on the risk factor isn't included in those. So I would deem them as attack surface management solutions. Typically, they're asset tools that are very good at identifying what you have in your inventory, but then you need to go off and actually do something about that manually. And so one of the things we'll talk about when we dive into the platform in a second is how we can actually automate a lot of that behavior. And when it comes to remediation steps, we know that the public sector is not quids in when it comes to resources to deal with and respond to vulnerabilities that have been discovered. So platforms that can take automated response on mitigating risk, but also helping limited teams prioritize their focus is what we're talking about here. What we often find also with legacy attack surface management tools is that they're not necessarily real time and up to date. And as we know, the threat landscape is constantly evolving. What isn't necessarily a priority today could be a high priority tomorrow. And if you're basing your tooling, your capability on information that could be days or weeks out of date, then actually is that making you effective at what you do? And I suppose one of the jewels in the crown that Trend brings to the party is our threat research and bringing information about previously unknown vulnerabilities to the forefront as well, and helping customers understand actually by joining lots of individual bits of telemetry information together, we can make much more joined up decisions around what is a priority, what is a risk based on what we're seeing within other parts of the world and other customers using security tools from Trend. So I'm going to dive into the platform now and just give you a quick overview of what sort of things we're talking about helping customers achieve here. Jonathan mentioned earlier on during his segment of the webinar our risk scoring, and this is what we're looking at here is a real-time presentation of what actually the risk profile of your organization looks like. We essentially create a risk score. So out of 100, how particularly risky an organization is based on a whole bunch of different factors and looking at a whole bunch of different assets. I use the assets phrase there or word very intentionally because we're not just talking about devices and endpoints. We're talking about services and servers, websites, etc. that are being published to the outside world. We're talking about user accounts and identity. We're talking about applications that are being used within the organization, be them cloud applications or hosted applications within your private cloud. And actually the kind of cloud assets themselves, so the AWS, Microsoft Azure, or other cloud providers that you're using to deliver the infrastructure that all these technologies sit in as well. All of these technologies and all these spaces can be combined into our platform here to provide a really comprehensive view and up-to-date level of risks that your organization is exposed to. What I really like about this executive dashboard is that I can compare myself to other similar organizations within the same territory, and I can see over a period of time, I can plot how my risk score goes up and down within the organization over a period. So this is actually kind of a bit of a gamification, I suppose, of risk management, and where we're developing priorities and strategies where we want to get our risk score down as low as possible. It's obviously a very helpful tool to be able to manage and track that. I won't dive into the summary now because there's a lot of information here to consume, but one of the things that we want to perhaps consider is, how I, sorry, bear with me 2 seconds, just trying to open that up. That doesn't seem to be working. That's very helpful. One of the things I want to consider is actually how the attack surface can be managed. So, what is the most meaningful thing that the operations team within my organization can do to actually mitigate the risk. So, for example, it might be that I need to apply some patches to address vulnerabilities on the machines in my estate. It might be that I need to apply some mitigating controls and some security technology needs to be turned on. We find that a lot of organizations invest really good money in cybersecurity tools, but then they fail to actually make use of those capabilities. So it becomes what we often refer to as shelfware, where stuff's really sat on the shelf gathering dust, as opposed to being used effectively to apply controls to the organization. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen quickly and share again. Apologies for the disruption here. Not entirely sure what's going on, but hopefully that will. There we go. We're back in the room. So actually understanding all of the devices within my organization is really important here. But as I said, from an operations perspective, what I also want to do is understand, what is, using artificial intelligence, for example, what is the attack path that a bad actor would take should something go wrong? So, when we're talking about quantifying risk and actually being able to understand what the priorities are, we've actually leveraging the capabilities of AI to say, look, we've seen lots of threats over the years, and the typical MO for a cyber criminal would be, if they did get into the organization, going after those crown jewels that Jonathan mentioned earlier on, they'd go here, here, and here, and these other assets, these other cloud accounts, these other users would be typically the ones that would be attacked as part of that. So we can use the risk scoring of all those individual assets to bubble up an ultimate risk score and build a priority list. One thing that we do very well here as well is use our capabilities within the platform to provide what we call risk assessments. So cyber risk assessments allow us to effectively look across the entire estate. So it could be, as I mentioned earlier on, the cloud posture, so the Microsoft Azure tenants that are being used within your organization. It could be that we're also using AWS or Google Cloud platform as well. And what I want to do is actually look at my cyber risk posture across all those different cloud estates and bring that information into a single platform that helps ultimately influence the way in which the cyber operations team prioritizes. What's great about this particular approach is that we can map the security controls against common standards and frameworks like the ones that Jonathan mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So we can have a really good idea ahead of any compliance audit that might be happening within the organization, how well I'm going to do in that particular audit, and obviously helps me apportion time and projects to perhaps address risks and mitigate things before that compliance audit happens. What I really like about the platform here is, again, we're prioritizing the most risky things that you need to approach, and actually what will be the most impactful thing to my risk score, what's going to bring the risk score down the most if I do X, Y, or Z activities. If I go back to the assessment, cloud posture is one aspect here. What we're also looking at is things such as the external attack surface, so the public IP addresses, the vulnerabilities that exist on the servers that I'm publishing to the outside world. This is probably actually the first way a cyber criminal is going to try and get into your organization, is trying to mitigate, exploit vulnerabilities that exist on your external attack surface. So if you can see that we're using deprecated security algorithms, or we've got out-of-date certificates, etc. These are, the typical ways that the cyber criminals are going to be trying to come into your organization. What's great is our friends here at MTI have basically made available to you these assessment tools to be able to use for free to get some really interesting intelligence around your cybersecurity posture. It might be, for example, when we're looking at identity, linking with Entra ID or Microsoft Active Directory, that we want to know about how your identity posture looks within your organization. Do you have overprivileged accounts? Do you have accounts that are perhaps stale, haven't been used for a period of time, or have weak security password policies applied to them, for example? All of this data and intelligence is all being brought into our Vision One data lake here to ultimately provide information on the security posture of your estate. But I know that working with the public sector for many years, that a lot of you will be using the Microsoft 365 technology. what's great about here is we can actually do an assessment of your Microsoft 365, your Office 365 accounts, and really get a feel for what your security posture looks like there, almost providing you with a second opinion. So yeah, we found, for example, last year over 44 million threats in Microsoft 365 mailboxes that Microsoft themselves failed to detect. We can help provide further intelligence and insight into what's sat in your mailbox, perhaps waiting to be manipulated by the bad guys. So it's really providing you with that second opinion and view into to what's going on in your estate. So I'm going to jump back into the PowerPoint. So just to finish up before I hand back over to James, just mindful of time. I think to me, what ASRM really represents is kind of an evolution of cybersecurity maturity. So as I mentioned earlier on a few times, customers have invested in prevention tools that have done a good job up until now at detecting the known threats, the stuff that the cybersecurity industry knows about. And then over the last couple of years, a lot of customers have invested in tools like EDR and XDR, so the ability to actually then respond to and mitigate to threats quickly when they happen. Really, attack surface risk management is the next step in that evolution towards a zero trust strategy, where we're getting onto the front foot, as I mentioned earlier on, and actually being able to be much more proactive about identifying and mitigating threats. The platform approach is a really important one. I think, we have a quote here from Gartner that by 2026, over 70% of all functionality relating to cyber attack surface is going to be delivered ultimately through a platform. I think what's really important to make clear about Trend is we are a platform vendor. We have a platform that has some really comprehensive security tooling, not just ASRM available in it, but I think we also recognize that the public sector has invested a lot of money in tools already. They have technology and workflows and processes that they've built around those toolings. The platform for us is not just about replacing technology or rip and replace, but actually it's about linking technologies together to ultimately help you drive better security outcomes. So for example, if you've invested heavily in the Microsoft technology portfolio, if you're using lots of other third-party security tools, Trend can link in with those and help you draw better outcomes from the intelligence that all those tools are gathering across your environment, as opposed to having very point products that operate in silos. Just a quick point on why Trend and MTI. MTI is actually our longest standing partner in the UK. We're very proud to be working with these guys. They're incredibly enabled when it comes to the Trend portfolio. So over the last 20 years, they've developed and trained and delivered a lot of our technology exclusively here in the UK. They're actually one of only a few handful of partners in the UK that have our managed security services provider competency, which is not an easy process to go through, by the way. Lots of accreditation and evidence-based stuff that needs to be provided to the team in order to be awarded that competency. One of only 5 Trend expert managed service partners as well. So MTI were a trusted pair of hands to deliver a lot of capabilities around Trend. And they ultimately have a lot of security expertise within their organization. Then when we talk about these cyber risk assessments, they're a really good team of people to work with to help you understand what your exposure to risk is and ultimately do something about that, I think, as well. James, I'm going to hand back over to you if that's okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan and Nick. Couple of pertinent points for me that I think were made this morning. Risk isn't static. I think we all know that, and it's how do we help you as a collective group move from that reactive to proactive way of tackling cybersecurity. It's no longer about point products. It's about solutions and outcomes for your businesses. We understand, or will help you to understand, your current posture, the landscape, the threats, the complexities around regulation and compliance and policies, people, technologies. The list goes on. But our approach at MTI and the organisation that I expect us to be is to form close partnerships with our customers and become part of your team and understand your challenges, your goals and objectives. And it's the end-to-end capabilities that we can support with and work with vendors like Trend to offer to our customers, from technical in-house capability to help to baseline or define a cyber strategy, in-house professional services, plethora of market-leading technologies, professional services to deliver, a managed service wrap to help you manage it and translate the risk up into your board. Nick mentioned a couple of fantastic assessments that can be used to start the journey or to support an evolving journey that your organization is on, that is available for free in the Trend platform, that we would love to support you in running a couple of these to see what we can find and help to mature the cyber posture of your organizations. Another thing that we offered as part of the event was at MTI have I mentioned at the start, one of the oldest, longest standing penetration testing organizations in the country, and as part of this webinar we'll make a draw of a free IT health check for one of our customers, and also a Cyber Essentials Plus that will be made available to everybody. I think that's on the next slide actually, Nick, just a couple of pertinent points for people. So that just leaves me to wrap up. As a reminder, there were a few questions that were asked in the Q&A or the chat as we went through the webinar. I'll make sure that the team collate all of those, and as I said, I think a couple were answered live, but we'll make sure that we follow up with any detail that's needed, and then if there are any further questions, then we can answer those. We will reach out to you to talk to you about some of these complementary assessments that are in the Trend platform. I highly recommend using them. And as I mentioned, the draw for the penetration test and Cyber Essentials will be made, and then we'll reach out to the organisations that were drawn. That's it from us. I would just like to thank both Jonathan and Nick for supporting this webinar this morning, and also thank you for your time. I appreciate it's 45 minutes out of a diary on a Friday morning. If you do have any burning questions, please reach out to us directly or via your MTI or Trend account manager. But I hope you found this session this morning valuable. Thank you all for your time.